In the Bible, we find all types of stories from our faith tradition, the ones that we first heard as children and that we've heard over the years. Stories like the one today, stories like the story of Noah and all those animals, Jonah who was swallowed by a whale, David and Goliath and Moses. We've heard of John when he was baptizing and speaking on this one who was greater, who would yet come. We know the stories of Jesus and the healings of the blind, and Jesus calling Zacchaeus out of that tree. We teach and we preach from these stories, and through it we proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and all that God has done for us. The gospel, according to John, is an account of the ministry of Jesus Christ. More than any other gospel, John develops an explanation of Christ's origin and Christ's nature. John's version has some features that are independent of the other gospels of Matthew and Mark and Luke. And in where we heard this morning from chapter 6, this is one of the best known chapters and one of the most beloved chapters in the whole Bible. In the weeks to come, we're going to have what I'll call an extended stay in chapter 6, where we're going to experience and talk about the mystery of Christ and his sacrament of the body and the blood. Chapter 6 begins with these two very familiar miracles that we've heard over the years of the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water. Both these miracle stories are deep, rich in the oral tradition of Christianity, and they're known as the Galilean miracles. The story of the miraculous feeding occurred and it was a central place in the oral tradition of early Christianity. This miracle story is the only miracle story that occurs in all four of the Gospels. Matthew and Mark even tell this story twice in their Gospels. We know the many familiar details of this story, but this story was especially popular because of the Eucharistic interpretation that it had for the early church of that Lord's Supper, of that final meal of Jesus Christ. This miracle story has the usual elements that we find in any miracle. First, there's that introduction where Jesus and his disciples are with this large crowd, and they're following him because of all these signs that he's given, all the healings that have occurred. Jesus has gone up the mountain with the disciples, and that question comes up of what are we going to do with this crowd, and especially what are we going to do with their hunger? After a short discussion, we get to the miracle part of this story, where from 5 loaves and 2 fishes, all those people are fed. In fact, they're fed so well that there's leftovers, 12 baskets of leftovers. And then we get to the final element of a miracle story, the results of that miracle. The people confess Jesus as the prophet who has come into this world. And with this evidence, with these signs that they've seen, they know he's going to be their king. Because of this, they're having the memory of that Exodus story and the imagery of the miracle there. The miracle from all this food that they've got, the miracle of Moses when the manna came down while they were traveling on the desert. And we know that Jesus realized what was coming. They were going to forcibly make him king, and he went off to the mountain by himself. The story of Jesus walking on water also holds that central place in oral tradition. This story appears in Matthew and Mark and in John, and it always follows the feeding miracle. The linking of these two stories shows their importance in the oral tradition. But John's account of the walking on the water is one of the shorter versions. And like other stories that John writes about, it has those standard elements, once again, of a miracle story, those familiar things that we know. First, there's that introduction where the disciples go down to the sea and they get into that boat to cross over to Capernaum. And then in the darkness of the night, the wind picks up and the water becomes rough and they become frightened. The miracle occurs when Jesus walks to them and removes their fears. And the results in this 6th chapter, John, automatically the boat was at the land. As much as these miracle stories share a familiar storyline and familiar details, there are differences between what is written in John and what is written in the other Gospels. In the Gospel of John, the traditional Eucharistic elements found in the other 3 Gospel versions are played down, or they're even absent from the Gospel of John. John describes the actions of Jesus more as the host of a meal. He takes the food, he gives thanks to God above, and then Jesus himself distributes it to his guests. In John's Gospel, he distributes the food himself. All the others have the disciples doing that. John also writes about the significance of Jesus' gift of himself. The source of Jesus' gift is an important in terms of Christological theme in John's Gospel. Christology refers to how we see the nature of God. Do we see him as divine? Do we see him as human? Christological is looking at how we see the nature of God. If we know the source of Jesus' gifts, then we come close to knowing his identity as the divine Son of God. When Jesus asked the question of Philip and Andrew, where are we to buy bread for these people? Neither of them are able to answer. They don't understand. The two disciples interpreted on the conventional level that we probably would have, well, if we had money, we could go down to Albertsons or Stater Brothers, but do you know how much bread we're going to need for these people? That's how they interpreted this question. They don't see that Jesus' question is asking about the gift that he has, about himself and the gift he offers for others. Jesus alone can feed this group, and there will be abundance. Each of the gospel writers also share that there was an abundance offered to this meal, enough to fill 12 baskets. These baskets of leftovers emphasize the hugeness and the vastness of this miracle. Not only were they all satisfied and filled, but there's leftovers. John offers unique words about this that the other gospels don't have. Jesus in verse 12 says, "Gather up the fragments left over that nothing may be lost." These words make a connection to Moses and that manna story in Exodus 16. Jesus' words are a caution against a repetition of what happened in Exodus 16, where Moses asked the people not to leave any extra manna. This manna story is critical, and I hate to do this to you, but that's for next week. Hold on to that thought about the importance of that manna and how they collected it up. It's kind of like one of those to be continued. That story's next week in the 6th chapter of John. In the miracle story of walking on water, Jesus' words are key to understanding the miracle that took place. In verse 20, Jesus says, "It is I, do not be afraid." These words are found in all three accounts of this miracle story, but they have a particular meaning in the Gospel of John. These words once again speak to what I said earlier, the Christological context, the nature or the character, the actions of Jesus Christ. John's Gospel portrays Jesus speaking the same way that Yahweh spoke in 2nd Isaiah. In 2nd Isaiah, these words were spoken of comfort to a people who were in great distress. Jesus uses these words, "It is I," or "I am," to speak of his divineness, to speak of his nature. The same can be said for that phrase, "Do not be afraid." This phrase, along with his walking on water, is the appearance of Jesus as the divine. As I read over these verses, one difference stood out, and it seems relevant for us today. John is the only writer who identified the little boy as the one coming with those 5 loaves and those 2 fish. Other gospel writers just say that the disciples found the food. Barley bread meant that this boy and his family were probably poor. This is the bread the poorest ate because it was the cheapest. The amount of food that this boy carried was enough for probably 2 people, maybe 3 people at a meal. There are some biblical scholars who feel that this boy's offering of his gift inspired others to donate the food that they had been hoarding for the Passover meal, the food that eventually fed the 5,000. When I heard this story about the loaves and the fish and the boy, I thought a lot about this boy. Was he supposed to bring that food home for dinner that night? What if his family, his parents, weren't at that gathering that day? Imagine when he got home and his mother or father asked him about the food and the whereabouts. Where was their dinner? Did the parents get angry at him? Imagine the parents. How in the world could you give away our dinner? That was our only food. And while this boy might have been scolded by his actions, he might also have reflected on what had happened that day and how he felt because of this prophet that seemed different than any other prophet he had seen before. Now, the parents could have also responded happily with the realization that this prophet took their food and he fed thousands. Perhaps they were proud of their son's thoughtful gesture. Perhaps they understood this prophet, that he must be the one sent by God, and perhaps that night they offered thanks for that prophet. My question to us today is, how would we respond to these two miracles if we had been with Jesus at that feeding or on that boat? If we were with those following Jesus, what would we have seen as the source of Jesus' gift? And would we have recognized the divineness of Jesus? Had we been on that boat with all the other disciples, would we have understood the actions of Jesus being the actions of God? Would we understand the revelation of the divine in Jesus that had just occurred? Would we make the connection when he said, I am, do not be afraid? What would our responses be if we heard these stories today, if we witnessed these miracles? In biblical times, these miracles and extraordinary signs were the traditional means of demonstrating the existence of God and the belief that Jesus was divine. Even through medieval and Reformation times, the belief in these miracles was still strong. But from the post-Enlightenment period on, these miracles don't impress people the same way they once did. For some, these miracles actually hold them back from their belief system because they know from a scientific, logical standpoint, they couldn't have happened. Our quizzical and scientific minds sometimes say that these miracles couldn't have occurred because of the knowledge we possess today. But we can still look at these miraculous acts in biblical terms by seeing the beauty in the feeding of 1,000 people on that mountain long ago compared to the thousands of people who go hungry in our world today. What started out as a dinner for a boy and his family multiplied, and the same can happen today when we respond to the words and actions of the divine Jesus, those words that tell us to care, to offer help to the poor, the hungry, the oppressed. We can still experience the miracle of Jesus walking on that water by looking beyond what seems like an impossible action and see how the presence of the Almighty Jesus calmed those who were frightened. Just his presence calmed those that were frightened or scared. There are so many in our world today, us included, who are afraid and who can be calmed by the presence of Jesus, by the presence of God. Where can we bring this message of Jesus Christ to people who are scared and are frightened? Where in our world can we bring these miracles of Jesus Christ to relieve people of their fears? That's a question that we need to think about as a church. Where can we bring these miracles in Ramona, in San Diego, to the world? Where can we bring these miracles and their message? The miracles of Jesus Christ are alive with us today, and those miracles have the same wonder as biblical times. Search for the miracles in the midst of our lives, those acts that bring the words and actions of Jesus Christ to life, who bring those actions, those words to the hungry, the scared, the frightened. Search for those miracles that let us know God is near, God is by our side, leading us on our journey. May our Lord, who gave us so many signs and miracles, continue to bless us in our hearts and give us the minds to recognize when the divine is with us. These things I pray to Jesus Christ. Amen.